Hey there, G3 here, and I'm gonna be just working on some Warhammer Age of Sigmar Seraphon or Lizardmen as I do a dungeon workshop and just talk about a something that I feel doesn't get enough attention within the D&D community when you're setting up a campaign for potential dungeon masters. And it seems so obvious because it's such a integral question to your adventures, but it doesn't seem to be really talked about too much. Now, while I do this, I'm just going to be painting. These are skinks for Age of Sigmar, but they make really great kobolds for D&D as well. And I'm going to I'm just, if you're interested in the painting side, in a cleanup kind of step where I applied blue to their eyes and their little lizard flap things, and I'm doing the cleanup where putting red over the areas that I went outside the bounds, because to me it's faster to do a large number of the blue really fast and don't worry about being messy, and then come back and then do again a cleanup step rather than each one of these individually trying to really specifically not go outside the bounds. So I have my little notes here, and today I'm going to be talking about where do adventurers and the concept of being an adventurer and going on adventures fit into your D&D society. And by that I mean your D&D campaign's social landscape, right? So the concept of adventurers is probably one of the alluring factors about D&D, because it's one of the reasons I think why it's a very popular role-playing setting. Is just fantasy, Tolkien type adventure, is because it's something so I guess easily a lot of people can connect to it. It's easy to connect to, but it also speaks to that it's like a mythical kind of world where everyone can be really awesome adventurers, right? So a role-playing setting in the real world, well, I'm sure there are some, I don't think has that as much of appeal because, well, you live in the real world and you can do real-world things, but this is about being an adventurer, right? But then the question that doesn't get answered, in my opinion, far enough, is where do adventurers and the concept of going on adventures and being an adventurer as your profession almost fit into your D&D campaign world? Right? Because if your 4 or 5 whatever players are the only ones doing this, then it certainly wouldn't be an established thing of saying, "Oh, we're adventurers." People wouldn't be referring to them as adventurers. If it's a thing, if it's a social, if it's so socially common that they've agreed essentially upon a name for it, and it's landed on adventurers who go adventuring, then it's got to be more common than just your players. So, which sociological wise means that it's either going to be a formal group or an informal group of a cohort of people that do this sort of thing and have their own cultural norms, and then society will have different things that they view it as. So I think it's really important to help. It's key to realize what that's going to be in your campaign world to influence every interaction that your players will have, because they're ostensibly going to be adventurers. So, by no means this is not an exhaustive list, but I just picked an array of examples from our real world history to kind of draw allegories. And you can mix and match and everything, but I think that in general it goes on a scale of, if adventuring is going to be the most socially acceptable and even admired to the least socially acceptable and condemned informally. Like, it's not going to go all the way to formal sanctions, right, where, like, it's illegal to be adventurers, because that would be a very strange campaign setting. Although you could probably make an adventure around, like, a certain place where it's illegal to be adventurers, but so that's the kind of spectrum, right? So let's start out with the most admired, right? And I drew from the, like, 15th, 16th century explorers going to, like, the New World, right? Which, you know, wasn't new because people were living there, but to if you go to, like, you know, kind of European-centric history, then it was the New World and everything. And, you know, I'm not a huge history source, right? So obviously this is going to be very precursory information. But so I think of, like, Spain, England, right, France, exploring the New World and rushing to claim territory. And then the rumors that abound about, oh, there's an Aztec city of gold, or there's, there are riches and strange produce and items that we can bring back. For instance, tobacco, tea, you know, all these things that were introduced to Europe that were so, had such an effect on its culture, came from the New World, right? So a D&D campaign where this was occurring, or where this model was taken up, I think would be something like what would be quote-unquote civilized area, and then one section that is wild. And the civilized area, or whatever, is sending groups of government-sanctioned people into that area on expeditions to try and claim land. Essentially it's that old thing from, high school history class of gold, God, and glory, right? So you want to get their exposing the inhabitants of those new areas to their religion, or for a D&D campaign, it could be, if they're clerics or paladins or whatever, to their type of religion, or it doesn't even have to be religion, it can just be to that country's government or whatever, right? So it's like, if they're for the kingdom of Rorgal, which is in my other video about an example campaign setting, right? They're like a classic Western medieval type of civilization. Then they would be planting the flag of Rorgal, right? And then gold, right? They want to make themselves and their country richer to find the resources in those areas, right? To go spelunking into caves and find old relics or whatever. And then glory, right? So that's the biggest portion of adventuring, in my mind, is that you want to be well known as an adventurer. You want the glory. That's why people play RPGs, because you want the glory of, being courageous in the face of adversity and, everything that D&D is about, to my mind, right? Telling great stories about great heroes. Or if you're playing, I guess, an evil campaign, great villains. But so that's that first example. Then we're going to go more to the middle, which I was thinking is not really socially admired, but it's not socially condemned either. And I was drawing from the 19th century, and I'm pretty sure I'm right on these dates, but again, not a history buff, so but essentially the 1800s and the gold rush in America, right? So if anyone's not from America, so they didn't have to take this in history class, it's essentially people westward expand. There was westward expansion because all the settlers came to the eastern seaboard of the United States, but one of the things that drove a lot of westward expansion was the fact that people were finding gold out west, and so a lot of people decided to try their luck and strike it rich by going out and prospecting and looking for gold, right? And now in real life, the rumors were far better than the actual results, and very few people actually, were able to get rich off that type of stuff. But it did mean that, that's what founded a lot of cities in the American West. So for a D&D campaign, I think you would need to increase the chances, right? So people do get rich off adventuring, but it's not something that is without its own risks. It's a high risk, high reward behavior, right? So, your average farmer, farmer's father type guy, like he lives on the farm, and he would probably teach his kids, like, oh, you don't want to go out adventuring, it's too dangerous. But maybe if a kid was, wanted to increase his status financially and, go on adventures, and he would consider that path and say, no, I'm going to go out into the unexplored, into the dangerous zones of the world, and look for treasure, and maybe I'll get lucky, I'll strike it rich. This also has elements of many have gone before you and failed, right? So you're going to be finding dead adventurers, or adventurers who are trapped in a dungeon, and you stumble across them, or even some adventurers who just made out of the dungeon and already took everything worth taking, right? When you get in there, maybe you chase them down, maybe you don't. So that's the kind of themes following that style. And you could definitely steal a lot from the gold rush and, the prospectors and things. And also oil rush, and like the companies and corporations that got set up in the American history as well due to these type of events, right? So maybe there are adventuring companies that are sponsoring these groups going in to try and strike it rich. And maybe they play dirty, right? Because out in the wild, there's not really the rule of law. So, maybe you come across a different adventuring band, and no one would think twice about, oh, we should slay them, or maybe we should just take all their stuff and rob them, or whatever. So there's a lot of really interesting opportunities with that one as well. Now, it should be said, all of these, I'm going under the assumption that, like many D&D worlds, there were former civilizations that have now since long been gone, which is why there are dungeons with magic items and gold and whatever in them. Right? There needs to be something to explore, too. There needs to be that untamed land. But in this model, in this middle model, it could be something like most of the land is settled, but there are patches in certain areas that aren't, that you can kind of go and explore. Sort of like America, right? Where you had some part, it wasn't like a new world, it was still part of that same land chunk, but it was a lot, they had maybe like the Louisiana Purchase, right? You bought a whole huge chunk of land, but they don't really know what's in it. So it's exploring something that's not entirely new territory, but is something that is not been fully settled yet and still has plenty of dangers and pitfalls, and that's what the adventurers are setting out to avoid and try and strike it rich. Alright, and then that brings us to option number 3 on this kind of scale, which is the one where it is socially condemned to be an adventurer. Now, though that sounds very grim, I actually think that this has a high potential to be a very fun and lighthearted type campaign, whereas the former two types had a lot of potential for danger, and like you're gonna either be beset upon by monsters unknown to your old a place of habitants, right? Like you don't know what you're gonna expect, or you go into a dungeon where some other adventurer had set up a pit trap to make sure no one else could get in, and you fall and break your leg, right? Dark kind of things. This one, I imagine, and I'm taking the example of in America, the 60s and the counterculture kind of hippie movement and things surrounding that. So it is in a society where there is enough resources and that people are settled enough that that people have free time and they can decide what to do with their free time. It's not like if you live on the farm, you're going to be working on the farm. If you're not doing something, then they'll find something for you to do. And then maybe there's one day where you don't work, and that's like the religious day or whatever. That would be in a place where it's still harsh and people are still trying to settle it. This instead will be someplace where people have free time, and but there's a lot of, and because the government's so established, there's a counter clash to it because of some conflict, right? So in this example, I guess, of the hippies, like the Vietnam War, but it could be whatever. And adventuring is looked down upon by the establishment and by the elders, and they say, "Oh, these kids today, they aren't, doing it the right way that we did it back in our day, right? How you're supposed to grow up. Now they're getting into this adventuring stuff, and they're going out and selling all their belongings and fitting everything they own into a knapsack and heading out in a random direction, so adventurers are seen as kind of like this counter movement to the norms of society that only a select few kind of choose to do. And this doesn't mean it's going to be totally safe, but it's like, I think that there should be more, I guess, what we would consider like cities and towns and like established places, because in this example it's going to be socially not acceptable kind of to be an adventurer. So they're going to walk into the town, people will be like, oh god, these are those adventurers, and maybe the town guard make up excuses for arresting them and all that type of stuff. But then the adventurers also stick together and they form their own communities out in the wilderness, and there are they make up their own norms, essentially, right? So whereas in the traditional culture it would be it's considered very gauche and like improper to carry a weapon. Maybe adventurers pride themselves on their swords and battle axes and whatever, or wearing the trophies of their adventuring days or whatever, right? So this one I think has the most potential for creativity, just because you can have all of this kind of like feeling that the adventurers are kind of looked down upon by people, and it's such a inversion of what you usually have in D&D, which by no means is wrong, because I think all of these are valid, but where people are like, oh my god, these valiant adventurers, we look up to them. I like the idea that the only people who look up to the adventurers are other older adventurers, and that the general establishment thinks that they're all kooks who have, just go off into the woods and do whatever. When in reality, these adventurers actually do go on pretty epic things, but they're not rewarded by the townsfolk feeling, looking up to them. They're kind of spit upon. And you could even, if you wanted, have like a very 60s hippie type thing where the government has maybe agents of their own control, right? So some sort of guard, like an imperial guard type thing, and or a king's guard, and they kind of are going against the adventurers, and maybe they even send out their own expeditions to go shut down the areas that adventurers are trying to adventure in, right? So if the king or whoever gets a hold of that old abandoned goblin mine before adventurers, then he's going to take everything in there worth looting and then destroy the place. And you gotta kind of like, it's I don't know, I just think it's very rife with a lot of fun role-playing potential, and people will definitely be able to latch onto it because or at least in my experience, I think people will, just because of that. No one likes to be told like, oh, no one likes their characters being looked down upon for doing cool things, right? I think it's a good way to bring people into role-playing, because they'll be like, oh, I just slew an owl bear and, took its talons and made a necklace. And then when they walk into town, people will be like, ugh, like, look at that, savage wearing owlbear stuff, and he smells and whatever. Like, why don't you get a job as a cobbler or something? So anyway, those were the three kind of examples I was coming up with of either the government sponsored, and people look up to the valiant adventurers traveling to the New World, and they are desperate to hear their tales of high risk, high reward behavior. The middle of adventuring is just a response to that there's kind of loot to be had and maybe not a lot of other job opportunities, so people kind of turn to it. And there are a lot of people who fail, but some of a select few will succeed. And then the kind of counterculture example of hippies or whatever from American history, where adventurers are looked down upon, and it's considered not something you should. It's a counter to what most people view as like the normal and acceptable kind of mode of life, but I guess has its own charm. So anyway, that's my ramble about these type of things. Where do you guys like to fit in being an adventurer into your social landscape of your D&D world? Do you consider it at all? Do you think it? Am I wrong? Is it not as important as I think it is? Sorry if the video is a little rambly and long, but I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.